Delighted to be joined now by former Energy Minister Graham Stuart, the Tory MP for Beverley and Holderness. Graham, lovely to see you. Do you mind if I call you Graham?
Not at all.
I think we know each other enough for me to call you Graham. Now, you decided to resign from government, which I thought was really intriguing because MPs aren't without ambition and you were doing very well in your brief. Why did you decide to step down? You said it was to focus on constituency matters more.
Yeah, well, I'd been a minister for nearly all of the last 8 years and just decided it was time to step back, concentrate on the constituency, get myself a little, slimmer, fitter, and re-elected.
But are you worried about I noticed that your majority is 20,000. I know you'll be familiar with the Frank Lund's theory that if you're a Tory with a majority of under 14,000, then you might not be safe. You're 6,000 above that threshold. But did you feel the need to sort of return back to your patch because you feel you do have to shore up support?
Well, not necessarily to win, although you're always best to treat your seat as a marginal seat. If you don't, then, the public can decide that you're taking them for granted and chuck you out. So I enjoy being a constituency MP. I always have. So I enjoy being on the back benches. I love being a minister. And it was great to serve and contribute through the energy crisis, which was, as you might imagine, quite stressful at the time. But we really pulled that off, putting in place all the schemes that supported families, businesses. We even had to stand one up for Northern Ireland. I just pay tribute to a lot of people talk about civil servants and whether they're all working from home. And the team at BEIS and now at DESNZ, the Energy Security Department, really are quite remarkable. People worked phenomenally hard. And to land a scheme in Northern Ireland, which we weren't even legally responsible for, make sure that every family got the support they were supposed to have, and have that go off without a hitch, was a tremendous achievement. And it was done under incredible time pressure. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of what we've done on the international net zero space. We really have led the global conversation. And one of the first things the president of the COP in Dubai mentioned when he announced the very positive result from that conference was the support of Alison Campbell, my chief negotiator, who'd been a key part of the team drafting what is an historic agreement, the UAE consensus. OK.
Let's get into some of those green policies and indeed some of these targets. Was that the COP that you had to fly back from?
It was,
because of the shoring up. What was that? Why did you fly back? Remind me.
I think it was Rwanda. Again.
Yes, they needed your vote on Rwanda. Yeah. Some people look at COP, everyone flying into Dubai by private jet, and think it's a massive load of hot air.
Yeah, well, I was said partly just to deal with that and maintain some sense of humour, is that I'm saving the planet one flight at a time. But necessarily...
But isn't that an oxymoron? Is there a point to saying, look, actually, if this summit is just a talking shop that doesn't achieve very much, and you always get the environmental campaigners saying, they've not gone far enough, what's the point? You can forgive the voters for asking the same question, can't you?
No, exactly. Well, that's why I quite like making that joke. It just acknowledges the fact that you do have to get together, and these ridiculous conferences with so many thousands of people coming together, I can see the absurdity of them, except they have made a difference. And if you look at the science is ever more stark, showing that the world is getting hotter. That means there's more energy in the system. It comes out in all sorts of ways, most of which are negative. And if you look at, if you did want to do the maths on impacts of COP, the savings on emissions absolutely dwarf the actual cost of doing it. And so, but all of us are made hypocrites by this because, protesters who may or may not be right to protest are typically coming using fossil fuels to get there. They were using fossil fuel-based clothing. It's a transition and it makes hypocrites of us all. But what I'm clear on is the science says that we do need to act. We need the whole world to act because the critics, many of which you'll hear on GBNews, who say, what's the point? We're less than 1%. Well, they're right to say that.
Yeah, well, let's drill into that. Okay. They are right to say that, aren't they? Because I think also looking at COP, many people are asking, well, what about China? There's always the what about China element to the conversation, which I know some of the Green Brigade dismiss. But this idea that we are responsible for lowering the world's temperature as Britain, our emissions have come down exponentially, haven't they?
50%. The world's first major economy to halve emissions.
So we've done really, really well. And you can understand the argument from the taxpayer sort of tearing its hair out saying, well, what more do you want us to do when you've got, I think the statistic is that China is responsible for 30% of all global emissions, and that in the last 8 years, China has emitted more carbon dioxide than the UK since the start of the Industrial Revolution. To quote Sir Tony Blair, don't ask us to do a huge amount when, frankly, whatever we do in Britain is not really going to impact climate change. This is a legitimate argument to make, isn't it?
It is, and it's one that should be properly aired. People should... I'm in trouble with too many people on the sort of green side of the argument is that it's such a level of zealotry. They don't listen and hear. It is a legitimate point, but... Yeah, I think of it because I have an amazing commons in Beverley. If we're all dependent on one common, a whole load of us, to live, and if we destroy that common, we're all going to starve. You can sit around going, well, I've done more than someone else. Why should I do it? In truth, we have to get on with it. And we have to save it because there is only one common and we're all dependent on it. And the UK has taken a lead, but there's no point if others don't follow. That's why we hosted COP26. We got the world to sign up. Before we hosted that, it was just 30% of global wealth covered by net zero pledges, in which case those skeptics' arguments would have even more weight. After we finished, it was 90%.
Yeah.
And last year at COP28, the world, including China and India and other major emitters, signed up to produce a pathway to 2035, which is 1.5 degree aligned. The world hasn't done anything like enough through these COPs, but instead of perhaps a 4 degree increase in global temperature, we've got it down to perhaps 3, perhaps a little less. We need to go further, and we do so cooperatively. The rest of the world is following. And so going back to the next question, which would come, well, what's the point of us doing it? And if we do, are we going to bankrupt ourselves? Well, the rest of the world is following. If you look at Europe, other countries that are moving, if the UK can lead, and so far we've transformed our renewables, it was less than 7% of our electricity was Labour's legacy in 2010. Now it's pushing up towards half. We've done that in a way which is cost effective. We've come up with great systems like contracts for difference, which help drive down those costs. If we do it right, we can develop our economy for the future-proof it, because the world is going that way, and we can come out with more jobs and more prosperity as a result of doing the right thing on the environment, rather than losing out. But it isn't without a cost. Well, and you might want to say to me, how much is it going to cost by 2050?
It's really tempting to say that. And of course, we can't ever get any answers. So this idea that it's going to be easy or indeed cost efficient to decarbonise the economy by 2050. The other thing I think that irritates people is, what is it with the setting of these arbitrary targets that seem to have just been pulled out of the air? If it's not 2030, it's 2035. Now we're looking towards 2050. Do you have any approximation of the cost?
Well, it is hard to put your finger on it, because when we went into the North Sea to do offshore wind, we did our first auction in 2015. I think it was around £120 a megawatt hour was the minimum that companies would accept. 2 auctions later, it had come down to £39.50. No one could predict that. So I know on the one hand it seems absurd. Here's a former net zero minister, you ask him a straightforward question, how much it's going to cost, he can't tell you, it's all a shambles. It's not. It's so big and it's so complex. It's hard to put a precise figure on it. But the science about the need to act globally is there and ever more stark. The world has indicated and recognised that science and the need to act, and we are in the lead. Now, we mustn't, and the Prime Minister's been clear on this, we're not going to sacrifice UK consumers, but if we can maintain our global lead, keep the lights on, and actually in the 2030s we expect electricity costs, thanks to moving to renewables, to come down. We will reduce our dependence on foreign fossil fuels, which, as we've seen over the last 3 years, can be bankrupting when the price goes up.
The British definitely want to do that.
Yeah.
But what about the whole 80-20 theory? So, for instance, say the ban on petrol and diesels. Wouldn't it have been better to say, actually, we want to move people onto hybrids because we appreciate that there are some long journeys that require petrol. We don't have enough charging points. Therefore, if we're saying to people you're using the hybrid aspect, the electric aspect of your car 80% of the time because 80% of journeys are closer to home, and only using petrol for that 10 to 20%, then we've done really, really well. Instead, you've come out with this arbitrary ban, which I don't know. It seems we don't seem to be ready for it. We don't seem to have enough charging points to begin with. And also making of batteries costs, the environment gravely, even the sourcing of some of the lithium and all the rest of it, seems to be sending children, up slag heaps or whatever. So you can understand the frustration of the GB audience sort of saying, have you actually put the infrastructure in place to achieve some of these arbitrary targeted aims?
Well, and again, that's a good question. And it is about being pragmatic as we go forward. And the Prime Minister's been clear on that. So that's why in September he said that the 2030 target had been moved back to 2035, not because we're resiling from our aims, but because we want to make sure we reassure the public. You've got to carry the public with you and get all those pieces which need to come together at the same time. So we've seen recently a 50% increase just in the last year in the number of charge points. So you kind of get the story, everyone's moving away from electric cars because there aren't the charge points, even as it scales up. And people will not commercially put in charge points if there aren't the electric cars. People won't buy the electric cars if they don't have the charge points.
People won't buy the heat pumps.
And they won't do it unless they've got...
But they won't buy heat pumps if they don't heat their homes adequately.
Well, I've got a heat pump at my home and it does a fantastic job. We need to look at rebalancing the kind of system costs, as we call them, between electricity and gas.
How much did it cost you to install that heat pump?
I think it was my house was already ready for it, so I think it was about £8,500.
Which is a lot of money. If you'd had a boiler installed, it would have probably cost £2,000.
Yeah, but my bills are extraordinarily low, as it happens. I'm not saying
it's going to take years for you to recoup the cost of the bills. If you're on low income, how on earth are you expected to pay for that?
That's exactly why we again in September, the Prime Minister announced a 50% increase in the subsidy of it. It's up to £7,500 per heat pump to help do that. And we're bringing down, as I say, the cost of electricity relative to gas, because at the moment we've disproportionately put bills on electricity and not gas, which goes against kind of nonsensical. So that has to be rebalanced, which is always the people you make happy, you never make as happy as the people you make unhappy.
Well, that is
in
true.
The best advice ever given to ministers. So that has to be managed. But we're on a practical path, and we can, if you're uber green, the UK has done more than any other major economy on earth, and we should be proud of that. And to the GB viewers who are sceptical, I'd say we are doing it in a practical way.
Graham,
the Prime Minister is listening.
We've had a very, I think, intelligent discussion about this topic this morning. I'm grateful for your insight. Thank you very much, Graham Stuart, for coming in this morning.